following up on what you were saying about that children do not understand consent and what's going on with their data tracking, do you think that children's data collection, storage, and commercialization should be different from that of adults? And then if so, how can this be done?
I do, but I think we also need to think about it in the larger framework. To understand what's wrong with the handling of children's data, we need to understand what the problems are that have arisen from the handling of adults' data. The issues that exist today in the space of adults' interaction with these devices is the fact that if everything that they do is watched and observed, every action is judged and results in some kind of consequences. Again, this could just be showing you a different kind of ad for shoes on a sidebar, but it could also be appealing to you to change your political affiliation, to vote or not vote on an issue, whether you are offered a job or not offered a job, or an invitation to apply for a job, or whether you receive some sort of credit or other position in your life. It is the fact that these decisions are being informed and influenced by the information that is gathered from you and about you through many different means by many different actors, and then traded and reshared and sold and rented throughout this information ecosystem. Now, part of the problem with this is we can understand where a service provider might need to hold records about a customer. Now, how long do they need to hold this data for? What if that person is no longer a customer? What if they have shut down that account? What if that address no longer exists, right? In the utility context, it's easy to see where we might create cases where we go, this data should age off. But the reality is this kind of data, this kind of record, should only exist for as long as it is necessary, for the minimum interval of time required to deliver on the requirements of a consensual relationship. Now, what does that mean in the context of everything that's not so clear? What does that mean in the informational space? What does that mean if you have a Gmail account? What does that mean if you have ever typed anything into the Google search box? What does that mean if you don't use Google services at all? You bought an iPhone. It has an Apple operating system on it. You downloaded an app from the store that's supposed to deliver weather services to you. But the people who developed that app added Google software to it, which the end user, you, are not even aware of because it provides analytics to the developer. And these programs are widely spread. They're called things like Firebase or Google Analytics. The developer of the weather app uses this to make money for themselves or to save effort for themselves, to understand the people who are running this application in this country are more likely to use this kind of phone. This kind of phone has a crash in the program when it operates in this way or that way, so they can improve their software. Again, we start to get back to that utility understanding where we go, okay, there are ways where this could be useful, but did you agree as the user for Google to have access to this data? Not in a meaningful way. You didn't know it existed. And even so, how long should that data be held? Should it be held for 1 week? Should it be held for 1 year? Should it be held for 10 years? Or should it be held for the period that increasingly approaches forever as data storage capabilities continue to improve? And the reality is, whether we're talking about Facebook, whether we're talking about Google, whether we're talking about Amazon, who runs half the internet beyond running this online superstore through the Amazon Web Services cloud hosting platform, it's important to understand that they all try to collect data about people and systems, the computers that interact with them and the devices that interact with them, not just their owners, maximally. And they try to retain this information maximally because to them, they see power and profit that can be derived from their unique understanding, their silo of insight into human behavior, or the individual human behavior of the species written broadly. This is things like the social graph, for example. This person is connected to this person. They are related. They live at the same home because their phones spend the night at the same place consistently, night after night after night. We see that this person works with that person because they go to the same office where those phones are the same place all day long. We see that this person calls that person at the middle of the night after they have a visit to the hospital. They call this person. We can infer it's a familial relationship. The social graph that shows this connection is one thing that is created. The second thing that is created, that is used especially by intelligence services, law enforcement services, is what's called the pattern of life. At what time does this person wake up in the morning? At what time does their phone become active? At what time does it begin to move? Where does it go? What stores is it likely to visit? Where does it sleep at night? Where does it work, right? What roads does it take? What products does it purchase? What sites does it visit for reading? You can tell everything about a person's political affiliation based on what sites. Not just do they read the news, but what site do they read the news from? All of these things can be inferred from your pattern of life, from your social graph. Now, when we talk about the handling of adult data and the handling of children's data from that, the problem with the handling of adults' data is that it is maximally collected, it is maximally retained. This eventually gives you a near perfect picture of a person's innermost thoughts and a tremendous ability to influence them. This could be through advertising, it could be through other kinds of behavioral manipulation. It also allows you to make decisions about them. All of these things are increasingly being automated. When we look to countries such as China, we see these things are beginning to be involved even in the issuance of travel permissions. And that is a very frightening thing. Now, what is important to be understood here is that all of the decisions that we are describing, where this data has been collected, it has been stored in bulk, and it is then being processed. It is being operated on to make decisions. Those decisions are based on inferences, because computers can only decide based on inference. The computer does not understand you, just as a human investigator could not possibly understand you, even if they followed you throughout the day. They could make inferences about your behavior, but they do not understand you, what's in your head. They do not understand why you made these things. They only infer what they believe is the likeliest explanation for this. And inferences are often wrong, even by the best human judgment. When we automate inference and we delegate that inference to an engine, to a machine, they become even less reliable, even though our algorithms will say they have an 88% success rate or something like that. That's terrible. That means 12 out of 100 times it's completely wrong. So we have the collection of data, we have the retention of data, we have the processing of data to create prejudgments about people that we have never met at global scale. The people who are subject to these inferences and judgments did not consent to them in a meaningful way. How can we improve upon that? The general link that permits this whole system to exist is the over-collection and over-retention of data. Because the only way that we can convince ourselves that these inferences are reliable, that they are valuable, that they are useful, is to try to create a complete enough picture of the private person's activities in those individual instances. Facebook says, we know this much about this phone number. We know this much about this email address. We know this much about this internet protocol address. We also know this much about this human face that we've recognized across our entire pictures platform. We know this much about this human identity because Facebook, for example, requires real identities to use their network. And we know that all of these identifiers are intersected, we believe them to be intersected, at a particular human person, right? This person has this email address, this phone number, they're engaged in this. Now, Google knows this much about them. Now, Amazon knows this much about them. We create that intersection of all of this, and it goes back 13 years. We believe that we know this person. If we take a great deal of that away by limiting the amount of data that can be collected in the first place, by limiting the duration for which it can be retained, by limiting the purposes for which it can be retained, and restricting the purposes for which that data can be used, suddenly that environment collapses to a much smaller volume. The inferences that could be made from such a data set, we ourselves can infer, would be used for simpler purposes, or hopefully would be used for simpler purposes. In the context of children, the same thing applies, but to a much more extreme degree. Even if we presume that people who've consented to this level of surveillance by interacting with these systems are granting a basically permanent license to create an unauthorized biography of that living person held by these many different companies that can be used for basically any purpose for an incredible period of time, we can presume that the company's arguments would be, well, these people are changing less frequently. They're, fairly reliable. They are developed. They are mature. They're sort of set in their ways. They go about these processes. It's okay. But children are changing constantly. And children need an opportunity to start over much more frequently than adults. Their political identities don't even exist yet. And when they do, they will change, or the possibility exists that they will change quite frequently and to great extremes. A child who believes, that everything should be about them, may go and have a much more socially minded future where they go, well, I'm actually now more concerned about all of us in aggregate. When you start thinking about consumer preferences, a child might want to eat sugared cereal all day long, every morning, but they're not going to want to do that as an adult. At least we can hope. But we all have the right to make our own decisions. The thing is, we have to have a way to enforce the ephemerality of records about us. The status quo today is that records are being created about people. And the only person who has no control over how those records are used is the person who they are about. Companies compile and create and control these records. Governments compile, create, and control these records. It is only the subjects of this observation, the people themselves, that are obscured from understanding what data exists about them, are unable to say you need to delete this data or remove this data, or this data should be aged off after 3 months or 3 weeks or 3 years or whatever. And this, I think, is the fundamental policy point that is unexplored. It is the ephemerality of data. We do not have an enforced limit on how long data about human behavior can be retained without express, meaningful consent. Let's go on from there, because I know you got more questions.
Yes. And related to this, what is your take on the right to be forgotten? And should it be different for children?
There's been an experiment, I think, in policy circles on maybe we can ameliorate some of the worst abuses of media excess and data collection through this constructed right to be forgotten. The reality is there is no right to be forgotten. It is difficult to enforce, and I think has been routinely abused to benefit those that the policy was not intended to advantage. It is rarely, I think, the dispossessed and vulnerable who are availing themselves of the right to be forgotten as it currently exists in regulatory frameworks. And it is, someone in a privileged position who is engaged in some kind of corrupt behavior or wrongdoing was exposed for and is then sort of trying to cover the tracks years later. Now, this might seem to be in tension with what I've described earlier about we need an ephemerality of data. We need to make records about ourselves evaporate after a given time. And I think this is easier to see if you think about the renewal of memory and how that operates on a social scale rather than on a commercial scale. The reality is what we have and has been eroded by the emergence of technology is a right to privacy, which put more simply is the right to be left alone. If we are not in a position of public influence, this can be corporate, this can be governmental, right? It doesn't have to be merely governmental, but anyone who has a position of particular influence in society should be held to a higher standard of scrutiny. This is a well understood limitation on the right to privacy. But what about the individual who is not in a position of public influence? Again, what about the child? What about the adult but younger person online who says something that was dumb or wrong or offensive? Should they be haunted forever by the mistakes of their past, by things that they wish they could leave behind? It's not about enforcing the right to be forgotten so much as recognizing these records throughout the entire story of humanity have existed only in the memory of those close to you. You know, you might wake up in the middle of the night, 20 years after a fact, and remember some argument that you had with a parent or a spouse or a child where you said something dumb or embarrassing or cruel, and you regret it. You wish you could rewind it. And the funny thing is, the other party to that incident, to that argument, to that embarrassing moment, doesn't remember it at all because it wasn't substantive. But we are sort of haunted by our own memory, and our brain, through the peculiarities of biology, will occasionally, wake you up at 3 a.m. You're trying to go to sleep, you're tired or whatever. And it's like, hey, now's a good time to revisit our classic photo album. Now, in smaller human societies, the people who knew you were the people who are around you. You were accountable to them insofar as you interacted with them. You had a direct relationship with them. And if you wanted to avoid them, you could move away from them. You could skip town. You could reinvent yourself. Or you could restart yourself. But when those systems of observation and accountability, which lead to prejudice, are institutionalized and divorced from geography, they're divorced from direct relationship, now you can no longer explain yourself because the other parties are global, they don't know you and they don't care about you. You cannot escape them because there is nowhere to go. They are an interrelated network. And what do you do? How do you restart with this? And I think this is where the right to be forgotten is a difficult thing. I can't say whether it's correct or incorrect. Maybe it is the correct construct. Maybe it is the correct idea. It is simply implemented and regulated improperly. But what we need is a shelf life on these records, or we should explore at least the idea of a shelf life on these records. So just like human memories fade, now our systemic memory can fade. However, and this is where the right to be forgotten becomes a little bit difficult. I don't believe we can order someone to forget, particularly in injustice done to them. We can invite them to forget. We can encourage them. We can give them every opportunity by caring for them, by trying to ameliorate or remediate the wrong that was done to them, and give them an opportunity to heal. But at the same time, I think if we order people to denounce their own memories, that can lead us to a very dark place, particularly when we start talking about these are corporatized or governmentalized processes that are directed and ordered by political creatures. However, if we can create a system, at least in theory, where what we do is we try to emulate that evaporation of human memory, save in exceptionally powerful circumstances. For example, when our brain wakes us up 20 years later because it wants us to learn from a mistake that embarrassed us, that I think is a better model.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at too is the option to choose, right? Where we're giving ourselves more choices. We have more information. We're able to make educated decisions about what's good for us rather than being profiled and being nudged in certain directions, especially for kids at a very, very young age who may not realize that this is going on.